Nigel Farage.
Thank you.
Well, good evening, everybody. Well done to your committee for getting this society off the ground. If this number of people turn up and it's lashing with rain, you're doing pretty damn well. I never planned to be involved in politics at all. I left school, didn't go to university, went straight to the City of London. It was the early 1980s. Mrs. Thatcher was the Prime Minister. Income tax rates were being slashed. And suddenly there was this massive, exciting move towards what was known as Big Bang. So I was one of the first of the real yuppies. You know, one of the people who earned a lot, spent even more, carried one of the early big mobile phones, and I was a capitalist, no question about that. And I thought the most important thing in life was to try and make as much money as one possibly could. So I never had any thoughts, any ideas, any ambitions of getting involved in politics at all. Until one evening in 1990, which I know to your age group seems like ancient history, but one evening in 1990, I was in my usual bar at about 5:30, just around the back of the stock exchange, and the news came in. A young lad from the office ran in with the news that Britain had just joined the exchange rate mechanism. And what it meant was that we decided to peg the level of sterling on the currency markets to the Deutschmark, and we were doing that as a precursor to joining what we all now know as the euro. And I'm not able to repeat exactly the word that. To be sure, I thought it was totally insane to try and peg our currency to the Deutschmark, knowing that the British economy and the German economy were clean different things. Our economy with much more emphasis on services than on manufactures. Our economy much more dependent upon the global market, and the German economy much more dependent upon the European economy. And I just knew that if you tried to peg one currency against the other, it would lead to financial disaster. And the next morning, travelling up to London on a train, looking at the newspaper, I saw that not just had the Conservative government signed us up to this, but that the Labour opposition were in full agreement with what had been done, and the Liberals agreed too. So all three parties agreed that we should give away our currency and sign up to the euro. That was back in 1990. And I remember thinking then, well, if all the politicians agree, I'm sorry, but I don't agree. And I felt at that moment in time there was nobody I could vote for. Well, things moved on, and we had a treaty back in the 1990s called Maastricht, and the backbench Tory rebels very nearly stopped it, but John Major, using a motion of confidence, managed to get the legislation through, something that had never been done in the entire history of the British Parliament. And by that time, I had decided by then that there was no difference between Labour and the Conservative Party on the really big issues, that any differences that existed even then were merely cosmetic, and that was when I decided that I'd get involved in politics. And just up the road here, in Eastleigh, in 1993, the Tory member for Eastleigh, a chap called Stephen Milligan, died in somewhat unusual circumstances. Political historians will remember this was the case of the chap dressed up in stockings and says, perhaps some of you would like this sort of thing, I've no idea. But dressed up in women's clothes with the ligature around the neck and the orange in the mouth. Perhaps the first ever case of vitamin C poisoning. So Milligan had died, and there was a by-election at Eastleigh, and so I stood for this brand new party called UKIP, so I was the party's first ever candidate, and I realised then that not only did I think that the entire political class had basically given up on Britain, but I also found that I was really fairly competent at it, and rather enjoyed it, and so the rest of my life ever since has been campaigning, fighting, and I have to say that when you look at what's happened today, I feel entirely justified in having made that move. You've probably all heard or seen David Cameron today, crying victory. He's only given away 450 million quid today of British taxpayers' money, and he says that's a victory. But he's managed to cap the increase to 2.9%. Cobblers. All the European Council can do is to give an opinion And that opinion will now go, over the course of the next 3 weeks, to a series of negotiations with the Commission and the Council, and the increase for Britain will be more than 450 million quid. And one of the reasons, sadly, that I won't be able to stay tonight and have a drink with you all afterwards, is I shall be heading off after this talk and after your questions to the BBC studios to go on Newsnight with Timothy Kirkhope, who is the leader of the British Conservatives in the European Parliament, who's probably got less charisma than Herman Van Rompuy. So I'm quite looking forward to the evening. But, you know, frankly, if you look at these parties today that we vote for in general elections, even if I was a little ahead of my time, back in the early 1990s, I put it to you that you simply cannot put a cigarette paper between them on issues of major substance. They all agree that we should be part of a European Union that now makes over 75% of our laws. They all agree that we should be signed up to a climate change agenda that is costing the British taxpayer £18 billion extra a year, and will do so for the next 25 years, including the insanity of building offshore wind farms, the most expensive form of energy that we've yet seen in the world, and of course totally and hopelessly unreliable, because in the middle of February and March we get a ruddy great anticyclone, sits over northern Europe, and not one of them turns. So but they're all agreed on that. They're all agreed that we have to massively slash defence spending. So much so that we now face the Gilbert and Sullivan type prospect of having 2 aircraft carriers without any planes to go on them. I mean, you really couldn't make this stuff up, could you? Although I suspect that the answer very shortly will be that whilst we won't be able to have British planes on the aircraft carriers, it'll be perfectly acceptable to have French ones. And I see this massive cutback in defence spending as a way of easing us in to a European Army, Air Force and Navy. We seem to have, again, a common view between all the parties that basically serious criminals shouldn't go to prison. I mean, Ken Clarke wants to let them all out. And even when we debate public expenditure, if you look at what George Osborne is saying and look at what Labour are saying, the differences are very, very small indeed. And what I will put to you this evening is that if we continue down this route, there'll be a time, perhaps we've almost reached it, when it becomes actually irrelevant who we vote for in general elections, who becomes the Prime Minister, who forms the government, because what we're sending into number 10 Downing Street is not a government of our country, it is a management team of our country. You know, I worked in a city, as I said to you, since Cameron has come to power, he has surrendered all regulatory control over banking, insurance, and finance and derivatives. All of those areas, Britain's biggest industry in future, all the regulations will be set by 3 EU institutions. So, you know, whether you want more city regulation or less city regulation, it won't matter whether you vote Labour or Conservative in the future, because all of those things will be decided somewhere else. And I think that this basic idea of governing yourself, of having your own identity, of having your own democracy, is something that really does matter. It certainly mattered to those that went before us, didn't it? Because twice in the 20th century, they were prepared to risk, and in some cases give, everything they had to defend that very principle. To defend the principle that not just us, but that we and other countries in Europe should be democratic states and not part of totalitarian regimes. And I'm not suggesting for a moment that the threat that the EU poses to us is military at this stage. But in a sense, in democratic terms, how is it any different? How is it any different if we cannot, by our vote, change the way we live?
To find out more about who we are and what we stand for, go to the UK Independence Party website at www.ukip.org.